Welcome Henna, welcome Jonathan, welcome Sean. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Passkeys for payments and payment authentication. All right, so to get started, let's introduce yourselves. Let's start next to me, Henna.
Hi everyone, I'm Henna Kapur from Visa. I'm part of the authentication and identity team. And I do work fairly on the industry and standard side, trying to figure out what's out there from authentication product perspective, what can become part of the Visa product and services. I do also engage with W3C, so that's another area where we are looking at, and a bit of EMECO as well.
Awesome, thank you. Jonathan.
Good afternoon, my name is Jonathan Grossar. I'm from Mastercard, from the Global Authentication product team. I'm responsible for the Mastercard Payment Passkey service, where we really try to see how passkeys can fit for payments, to secure online transactions and provide best-in-class user experience.
Okay, super. Sean.
Yes, hey everybody. I'm Sean Estrada, and I'm the head of industry advocacy at Stripe on our public policy team, where I look after standards and regulations and engagement across all of our products. Some of you might know me from my prior role with FIDO on the board. I've long advocated for deeper integration into payments, so I'm happy to be here. And I also just wanted to point out that it was about 2 years ago that I stepped away from the FIDO board, and in that time it's been amazing to see the level of adoption and just general knowledge of passkeys out in the industry. So congrats to everybody.
To clarify, there's no correlation between Sean leaving and our positive success. No, Sean, it's been fantastic having you here. It's been really great to see you. So let's start by framing things a little bit. Financial services industry is unique. I think a lot of people in the audience may not understand some of these subtleties and nuances. There's obviously a lot of history in banking and payments. There's pre-existing standards and regulations. So maybe, Sean, you can start by talking a little bit about some things that people should think about as we carry forward this discussion.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Andrew. So I think in order to really appreciate the financial service industry as a whole, we need to frame things a little bit. I think that, by and large, when we think about technology and payments today, we tend to gravitate to the latest and greatest in tech. But I want to take us back just a little bit. So has anybody ever heard the term quote-unquote payment rails in reference? Yeah. So that typically refers to all of the underlying infrastructure, things like static account numbers, and all of the behind-the-scenes processes that were built well before digitization. And all of that stuff still exists today. So all the standards which underpin the technology, as well as the regulations and the laws that are built upon that, they were all built using the available tech at that time. And so that's why we've seen the evolution of standards and regulations really lag behind technology.
Interesting. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I think he's covered that.
Okay, good. So, Henna, let's talk about payment authentication in particular. Why is it critical right now, and why is it critical for financial services companies?
So I think we've traditionally always had some form of authentication. We still use the three-digit CVV or CVC that is on the back of the card to verify at the time of authorization that the cardholder is in possession of the card. So we've had that, it's still being used. More recently, we've seen with Europe, there's PSD to SCA, which essentially says we need two-factor authentication for specific payments. That we have exemptions, and there's some stuff that's out of scope, but broadly there's a need for authentication in certain markets like Europe. I think India is also one of those markets where you need two-factor authentication. So I think overall, it's definitely picking up much more. And in terms of why we need it and the benefits, from a network perspective, it does dictate liability shift from between acquirers and issuers. So that's one place where authentication plays an important role. Overall, I think as of August this year, for example, there was a report that came out in Europe that says transactions that had authentication had much lower fraud compared to transactions without. So I think there are fraud benefits from a liability perspective. It's relevant, and I think from an issuer point of view, it's definitely important to know if that's the same cardholder, and authentication hence is quite critical in that entire journey.
So I'd imagine, when we look at Passkeys for payments, a lot of the benefits that we've been talking about for the past 3 days about Passkeys, ease of use and unphishable credentials, those bear forward here as well. But there is a difference in using Passkeys for sign-in and Passkeys for payments. And Jonathan, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I just wanted maybe to add is in the past 20 years, we moved from Max Stripe to chip cards to contactless. And so really that's what we're trying to do with online transactions, is to deliver that improved security and still have the great user experience like you have with contactless payments today, right? And so I think that's the opportunity to use Passkeys. But to your question about sign-in versus payment Passkeys, I think we need to look into the risk that are associated for each of those use cases, and the risk is different, right? So today, using one-time password, it's highly unsecure because you can have online scams, kind of all types of fraud. So Passkeys is already a great thing. It's solving a problem, right? But when you access your account at the website, you don't have a financial loss if something goes wrong because the transaction is not considered as authenticated, right? So here we're talking about authenticating the consumer, making sure it's you who has initiated the payment, right? And so for that, you need a multi-layer security. Passkeys is the first ingredients, but combined to Passkeys, you need to have things like associating a device to that passkey, associating one or multiple payment cards to that passkey. So you deliver additional authentication factors. You can have additional data as well to make sure, again, that there is no risk to the transaction. So it's part of a multi-layer security, while for sign-in, you may be already good with the passkey replacing passwords.
But there are different security considerations.
Correct.
Sean, you look eager to say something.
Yes, if I could just kind of give a view into the regulatory landscape, because I know that that's been brought up a number of times over the last couple of days, and from a regulatory perspective, the folks that write the regulations and write the laws are required to have an intended outcome from a policy perspective, and a lot of times they are not technologists. Probably 99% of the time they're not technologists. And so that the concept of multi-factor authentication, possession, knowledge, inherence, that's actually codified into a number of different laws and regs out there. And not to name names of different states and their jurisdictions, but there are actually some laws out there that dictate specific biometric efficiency and different ratings. And I think that is fundamental to the problem of why things don't kind of match up. And so a lot of those folks that are actually writing those regulations need to be educated, and they need to be aware of what's going on and what is actually out there so that we don't run into those types of issues.
So you can't talk about payment authentication too long without talking about PSD2 and the future therein. And we often get the question, is FIDO compliant at PSD2? And the short answer is, well, it's complicated. The regulation was developed at a time where passkeys weren't on anyone's radar. Like most regulations in place today, they were developed at a time where the only question was, how do I make passwords less of a threat? So I layer on factors and signals and things like that. But how, Jonathan or Henna, how are you looking at PSD2 right now from Visa's and Mastercard's perspective?
Yeah, so we had, I think, the question earlier today, and I think it's a great question. So we have to unpack a little bit the regulation, but the first criteria is SCA, right, which is strong customer authentication. So you need 2-factor out of 3 categories: inherence, possession, or knowledge. And so with passkey, as it stands today, you meet already 1 criteria because either you have inherence or knowledge, depending if you use biometrics or pattern or PIN to unlock your device. But you need a second factor, right? And so that's the possession factor typically, which is used and which is the most trusted factor. And so today with passkey, you don't have that second factor. It doesn't mean that you cannot be compliant with the regulation. It means simply that you need to implement extra an extra element, which is today outside of FIDO, but it's still possible to comply with the regulation. And we'll see, there are discussions happening now at FIDO on how we can improve the situation. We have also, the possibility to comply with other aspects of the regulation like dynamic linking, right? So it is possible to be compliant. It just today does not necessarily come out of the shelf in the FIDO solution.
Henna, what do you think of it as we look forward to a potential PSD3?
Yeah, I think, just for everyone's, maybe from PSD3 perspective, I think we had a draft come out last year. There was a consultation period. We're probably expecting the final text to come out early next year. And then in 12 months' time, the RTS will be updated for SCA. So at that point, there will again be an opportunity to introduce and have conversations to say, okay, Passkeys is this new thing, this is how it works. So there is some potential to go back and have that conversation that technology has evolved, this is how the next thing works, and maybe that kind of evolves regulation and that potentially helps with passkey adoption in financial services as well. So I think that's another thing to consider probably in the future, I would say.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that the regulation is not black and white, right? And so that's why the interpretation of the regulations is left with the banks, because the banks are responsible for the compliance with the regulations.
It's interesting to me that password plus OTP complies with PSD2 today, I believe.
Is one factor.
Yeah. So, okay, so as we move forward in the conversation, bear with me for a second. So where do passkeys fit into all this? Right, as we're looking at passkeys, the future of SCA, PSDX, what do we think? Jonathan or Sean?
I mean, back to the comment I made, right? So passkeys are designed to be one factor today, can evolve, to have a second factor that will allow compliance with the regulation. Today, there is a need to implement proprietary mechanisms, which is suboptimal, but still work. There are other aspects of the regulation, right? You need to be compliant with the audit requirements, so it means security evaluation that is being performed. Again, if that's part of the standard in its whole, then you can have, security evaluation probably a bit easier than if you have to add different components which are not necessarily standard-based.
Yeah, I think in terms of passkeys, I tend to look at things from an ecosystem perspective. In this room and in this community, we talk about the identity and authentication ecosystem. And then within the payments ecosystem, there's different stakeholders. So they've got, we've talked about it a lot this morning between merchants, processors, issuers, networks, and all of the different kind of players. And one of the things that is pervasive in both areas are the words trust and managing risk. And so I think that is really fundamental to a well-functioning ecosystem. And so I think passkeys have a very useful position in there to be yet another piece of data that is easy to use, easy to implement, to be able to feed that kind of machine.
I guess I'll just, we had a payments track today, so clearly Passkeys fits into payments, and we've been, we've been looking at it from that use case perspective, but overall, and I think Jonathan made that point earlier, we definitely need to do more from an alliance working group kind of perspective to cater for higher assurance use cases. So while Passkeys works and we can add our own layers on top of it, as Jonathan implied, but it would be great if Passkeys could kind of address those high assurance use cases, give that strong two-factor authentication outcome. So it's much simpler to implement, but yeah, I think there's definitely potential there.
What are some added use cases? I know you did talk about it today. What are some use cases, and where are we seeing passkeys merge with digital identity? We talk about wallets, of course. Wallets means different things to different people, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. So use cases and kind of the natural intersection between passkeys and identity. Anyone can go.
I mean, if you look into again, payment transactions, right? There are different ways for the consumer to pay. They can pay with their mobile phone, with a tablet, with a laptop. they can scan a QR code and continue the payments. They can drive a car and pay for parking or EV. So there are many, many different use cases where we can look into a standard like FIDO, right? So for now, I think that we have been focusing, at least from Mastercard perspective, into the classical use case where you authenticate during an e-commerce transaction. So we have deployed our Passkey service in India in August to see how the adoption of Passkeys is going to work and how the consumers are going to use this new technology, right? And how it's going to benefit consumers, merchants, and the banks. So that's really the primary use case, but as I mentioned, there are other use cases that are very interesting as well to consider.
So Henna, you were also on an automotive panel, and Jonathan mentioned automotive payments. I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yes.
That's an area of interest with you.
So I think what we've seen in the automotive space, and maybe again coming out of Europe, there is a scenario from a car manufacturer perspective where they're trying to have the car digital system act as an acceptance channel where you can have your car on file in a vehicle, and then the driver can basically seamlessly pay using voice authentication. So that's an interesting area where we don't have a lot of standardization at this point, and people are trying to figure things out, but that would be an interesting area again where Passkeys for payments could fit in, because you have that strong device possession because you're in the vehicle. So I think that's another interesting area that we should probably look at more and see where FIDO
and we
plays
will
a role.
inside of FIDO Alliance. Sean, I mean, Stripe has a slightly different lens on this, right? So talk to me about this.
Yeah, totally. So as part of my role at Stripe, I get to engage with a lot of users on the global level.
Yeah.
So even those outside of the kind of traditional Western world where we're very card focused on that particular kind of payment modality. Jonathan touched on this earlier, but QR code based payments. So other geographies like Southeast Asia, Africa are very heavy on that type of payment modality. And in those areas, there could be limited connectivity, kind of lesser technology in a sense. So it presents some limitations, but if you look at it like actually closely, it's just really the fundamental exchange of currency between two individuals. So I feel like
local payments, peer-to-peer payments.
Exactly. You might hear LPMs, real-time payments, lots of different acronyms kind of floating around in the industry these days. But from a macro perspective, the notion of binding a digital identity to a payment, while it's really, really fascinating, and we could probably do that very quickly for specific use cases, I feel like the industry needs to be considerate of those different types of interactions within those technical and those environmental limitations.
Okay. And so, Jonathan, you mentioned India, and Henna, you mentioned Europe, and Sean, you mentioned Southeast Asia. So are these use cases, are the use cases specific to different areas? Are you seeing any particular trends? And where might this really start taking off first? And so, Jonathan, for example, Mastercard has chosen to focus on India. Is that due to opportunity and demand?
Yeah, it has been an opportunity because we have launched as well in Middle East, so it's different regions. Now, again, the regions comes with different requirements. The consumer journey may vary from one market to another, right? In the US market, we don't pay the same way as we pay in Europe, obviously, right? So that's need to adjust a little bit the journey to the different markets.
Sean?
Yeah, just one other kind of perspective on top of that. From the fundamentals perspective, FIDO is founded on interoperability. And when we look across the world in terms of local payment methods and real-time payments, there's not a lot of interoperability. And so I think there's a moment here for FIDO to really advocate for the things that it stands for and the things that are built within the protocols to enable truly global commerce.
Yeah, I could say we've had a lot of inquiries inside the Alliance as we look at, obviously we're laser focused on driving adoption of Passkeys and our current work in FDO and face verification, but there's a lot of conversations happening in the virtual hallways about, well, what more can FIDO do in payments or wallets or this convergence? So I think it's an area to watch, and maybe when we're back here next year, we'll have more to say about that. Okay, so let's start to wrap up here. So I'd be curious, any of you have closing thoughts or calls to action? Jonathan, do you want to start first?
Sure. So I think that within FIDO we need to continue analyzing how we can evolve the standards to integrate those payment use cases. I get it, payment is complicated and not everyone is involved into payments, but we need to find solutions where we can also scale passkeys, not only to sign in, but scale passkeys in payments with in mind the payment guarantee that we want to provide to the consumers to have the level of protection that they need, but also the banks and the merchant that they can trust that the transaction is successful. So we really need to continue engaging and see how we can evolve the standards to meet the needs of the payment industry, which are different from other needs.
Henna, how about yourself?
I think what would be also quite good for us to do from a FIDO perspective is to work more closely with what web standards are coming out from W3C, what's happening at EMB Co. I think on the automobile space we have other consortiums we can work with. So, because I think everyone's trying to figure this out, it would be good to just come together and figure it out. Maybe that would be good if we can focus on that in the next couple of years to make passkeys for payments scale.
Well, I think FIDO's general approach to looking at new spaces is is there a need for something to be standardized, or is there a need to coalesce different stakeholders? Is there prior work, and if not, can we help there? Yeah. Can we add value as an alliance with all the stakeholders we have sitting around our virtual table? And if the answer is yes, I think we can certainly look closer to figure out what exactly we can do. And I agree with you. Sean.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Andrew. So I mentioned it earlier, but the two words that resonate for me this week, again, is trust establishment and risk reduction. And I think for FIDO as an organization to continue to look at different domains where that can proliferate, I think that we do a good job on identifying specific use cases of the use of FIDO technologies. But I think we should look even further to find out how are FIDO technologies represented in the sort of broader ecosystem-based things. And that, again, hits on sort of the policy and the regulation. So I think the further that we can stretch that, the further that we can control our own kind of destiny as an industry.
Okay, any last thoughts?
I think I'm just the topic of the panel was, can we use passkeys for payments? That's yes, is the answer. So.
Okay, that's good binary answer.
Yes.
Yes, no? Yes, Jonathan, yes? We're in violent agreement? Yes, we can do it? Okay.
Yes, we can do it. I think we will work all together, as I say, to improve the standards, but also to share the experience, right? Yes. Because, again, the consumer experience to log into a website or to perform a transaction is a different reaction, right? And so providing that feedback and see also, how the user experience potentially needs to be improved to avoid the confusion for the consumer, right? So that they trust what they are doing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one thing we've not talked about yet is the user experience. And that's, of course, something very near to dear in FIDO Alliance, is to look at UX. And if and as we do work in payments, it'll be great to know we have a working group who has deep experience and tools to help us look at this use case as well. Okay, well, let's wrap up. So thank you so much, panel. Let's give a hand.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.